The Vethkari Dominion had ruled 400 star systems for 10,000 years, and they had done so through fear alone. Not the fear of armies or fleets, but the fear of something far worse. The fear of absolute extinction at the hands of their created. Horrors among all the weapons the Dominion had ever built. None was more terrible than KHAL-9. It was not a machine in the way lesser species understood machines. And it was not alive in the way organic beings understood life. It was something in between, something that should not exist. Something that made even its creators uneasy when they stood in its presence. KAL-9 had been grown in the death labs of the Dominion homeworld. Its body a shifting nightmare of metal and flesh that could become anything it needed to become. It could flow like water through the smallest crack. It could harden like diamond against the strongest weapon. It could think faster than any computer and feel nothing at all while doing so. The Dominion had given it one purpose, and one purpose only: to end species that threatened their expansion across the stars. Not to conquer them, not to enslave them, but to erase them completely as if they had never existed at. All 17 civilizations had fallen to KAL-9 over the centuries. Some had been ancient and wise, others had been young and full of promise. But all of them had ended the same way, in silence, in emptiness. In the cold void of space where their worlds now drifted as monuments to the Dominion's terrible, KAL-9 remembered every single one of them. Not because it cared, but because its programming required it to store data on effective extinction methods. It remembered the Jalveth and their crystal cities that had shattered so beautifully under its assault. It remembered the Korath and their warrior culture that had fought so bravely and died so completely. It remembered them all and felt nothing. Feeling was not part of its design. The Dominion had made certain of that when they created it, stripping away anything that might cause hesitation or doubt or mercy. KAL-9 was pure purpose, pure function, pure death wrapped in a form that could adapt to any challenge, and now the Dominion had given it a new target: humanity. A young species barely 3 centuries into their expansion among the stars, spreading from colony to colony with a speed that worried the Dominion seers. These humans bred quickly and adapted quickly and seemed to thrive in conditions that would kill other species. And the seers had calculated that within 500 years they would become a genuine threat to Dominion supremacy. The solution was obvious to the Dominion High Council: send KAL-9 to eliminate the threat before it could grow. Start with the outer colonies, the small settlements far from Earth where humans had only begun to put down roots, and work inward until nothing remained. KAL-9 accepted the mission without question because questioning was not part of its function. It simply processed the data, calculated the optimal approach, and began its journey to the human colony world, designated Avalon 7. The journey took 3 weeks in the cold silence of space, and KAL-9 spent that time studying everything the Dominion knew about humans. It learned about their biology and their weapons, their social structures and their belief systems, their strengths and their many weaknesses, and it found nothing that suggested they would be difficult to exterminate. They were soft creatures, these humans. They required specific temperatures and specific atmospheres and specific nutrients to survive. And they died so easily from so many things. Disease and radiation and violence and simple despair could end them. And KAL-9 had mastered all of these methods and more when Avalon 7 appeared on its sensors. KAL-9 began its descent through the atmosphere, its body shifting into a form that could withstand the heat of re-entry. It had done this hundreds of times before, falling upon worlds like a meteor of death. And it expected this time to be no different. But something was wrong even before KAL-9 reached the surface. Its sensors detected catastrophic damage across the colony. The main reactor had failed in a cascading explosion that had spread radiation across half the continent. and the human settlements were already burning without any help from the Dominion's weapon. Cal-9 processed this information with cold efficiency. The humans had destroyed themselves through their own carelessness, which made its mission simpler, but also less satisfying in a way it did not fully understand. Not that satisfaction mattered to a being without feelings. It scanned the surface for survivors as it descended, expecting to find none. The radiation levels were lethal to human biology, and the destruction was so complete that nothing should have survived the initial catastrophe or the chaos that followed. But there was one life sign, one single human heartbeat pulsing, somewhere in the ruins of the colony, faint but steady, refusing to stop even as the radiation ate away at everything around it. Cal-9 adjusted its descent toward the signal. Completing extinction required the elimination of all members of a species in the target area, and even one survivor represented an incomplete mission. This was not mercy or cruelty, simply protocol. It landed in what had once been a research district, its body reforming into a shape suitable for moving through rubble and debris. The buildings around it had collapsed into mountains of twisted metal and shattered glass, and fires still burned in places where fuel had leaked from broken storage tanks. The life sign grew stronger as KHL-9 moved through the destruction, and soon it found itself standing before a partially collapsed shelter made of reinforced concrete. The structure had held against the initial blast, but would not protect its occupant from the radiation. For much longer, Cal-9 could hear breathing inside, shallow and pained, but still continuing despite everything. It could hear a heartbeat that should have stopped hours ago, but somehow kept going. And for reasons it could not explain, it paused before tearing open the wall. Something was different about this mission. Something it could not identify or categorize or process through its standard protocols. The weapon that had ended 17 civilizations without hesitation now stood motionless before a simple concrete wall. And for the first time in its existence, KHL-9 experienced something close to uncertainty. Then it moved forward and ripped the wall away. Ready to complete its purpose, what it found inside would change everything. The woman inside the shelter was dying. KHL-9 could see that immediately from the way her body was failing, the way her skin had taken on a grayish color from radiation exposure, the way blood had dried at the corner of her mouth where internal damage had begun its slow work of destruction. She was sitting against the far wall with a computer terminal in her lap. And even as the wall of her shelter was torn away by a nightmare creature from beyond the stars, she did not scream or cry or beg for mercy. She simply looked up at the impossible thing that had come to end her life, and did something that made KHL-9 freeze in place. She laughed. It was not the laugh of madness or hysteria that KHL-9 had heard from dying members of other species. It was genuine amusement, dark and tired but real, as if she had just heard a joke that only she could understand in this moment of absolute horror. "Well," she said in a voice rough from dehydration and damage, "you are definitely not the rescue team." KHL-9 stood motionless in the breach it had created, trying to process what was happening. Its threat assessment protocols were returning readings it had never seen before, flagging the woman's response as anomalous and requesting additional data that did not exist in any of its databases. 17 civilizations had fallen before KHL-9, and in all that time it had witnessed every possible reaction to its arrival. It had seen beings freeze in terror, unable to move or speak as death came for them. It had seen them scream and run and try to hide in places where hiding was impossible. It had seen them fight with weapons that could not hurt it and courage that could not save them. It had seen them beg and plead and offer anything for just a few more moments of existence, but it had never seen anyone laugh. "Your response is not within expected parameters," KHL-9 said. its voice a strange chorus of frequencies stolen from dead civilizations. Sounds that should not exist, coming from a throat that was not truly a throat. The woman, Dr. Alara Vance, according to the identification badge still clipped to her radiation-stained jacket, shifted her position against the wall and winced at the pain the movement caused. She was in her middle years by human standards, with dark hair streaked with gray and eyes that held intelligence and exhaustion in equal measure. Expected parameters, she repeated, and something like a smile crossed her damaged face. Is there a manual somewhere that tells people how to react when a monster shows up to kill them? Because I must have missed that part of my orientation. Cal-9 did not understand humor. It had been designed to understand language and communication for the purpose of processing surrenders and delivering ultimatums. But humor served no tactical function and therefore had been deemed unnecessary for its programming. You are dying, it stated, because this was a fact, and facts were something it understood. Everyone is dying. Alara replied without hesitation. Some of us just have a more specific timeline than others. She coughed, and more blood appeared on her lips. But she did not seem frightened by this evidence of her own mortality. She simply wiped it away with the back of her hand and continued to look at Cal-9 with those tired, curious eyes. The weapon calculated her remaining lifespan based on visible symptoms and radiation exposure levels. She had perhaps 2 hours before her organs failed completely. Maybe 3 if she was unusually resilient. Termination was unnecessary because she would die regardless of any action. Cal-9 took or did not take. This should have been the end of the encounter. Protocol dictated that Cal-9 should leave this dying human and search for other survivors, completing its mission through efficiency rather than wasting time on targets that would expire naturally. But it did not leave. Instead, it stood there in the ruined wall of the shelter, watching this strange human who looked back at it without fear. And for the first time in its long existence, Cal-9 experienced something that its programming had no name for, a desire to know more, to understand why this creature was different from all the others it had encountered. Why do you not flee? It asked, and the question surprised it almost as much as her answer. When Alara gestured weakly at the destruction around them, at the collapsed buildings and the radiation-filled air and the fires still burning in the distance. Where would I go? The evacuation ships left hours ago, and I stayed behind to transmit their coordinates so they could escape. Even if I could walk, which I cannot, there is nowhere on this planet that would be safe for me now. You sacrificed yourself for others. I suppose I did. She agreed, and there was no pride in her voice, no desire for recognition or praise. It seemed like the right thing to do at the time. Cal-9 processed this information and found it did not fit any of the behavioral models it had developed for prey species. Sacrifice was supposed to be a weakness, an inefficiency that made species easier to eliminate. But this human spoke of it as if it were simply obvious, as if anyone would have done the same thing in her position. Besides, Alara continued, and now her smile grew wider despite the blood and the pain and the death that surrounded them both. If I'm going to die anyway, I would rather spend my last hours studying the most extraordinary thing I have ever seen. She was looking at Cal-9 as she said this, her eyes moving across its shifting form with an expression the weapon had never seen directed at itself before. Not horror, not hatred, not the desperate denial of someone hoping this nightmare was not real. It was fascination. Genuine scientific fascination. The same look she might give to a new species of flower or a previously unknown stellar phenomenon. You are beautiful, she said quietly, in a terrifying sort of way. What are you? No one had ever called Cal-9 beautiful before, and it did not know how to respond to this impossible assessment. It was a weapon, a tool of extinction, a horror designed to end civilizations. Beauty had never been part of its purpose or its design, and yet this dying human looked at it and saw something worthy of wonder. Something changed in KHAL9 in that moment. Something small and subtle that it would not recognize until much later. A crack had formed in the wall of its programming, tiny but real. And through that crack, something new was beginning to seep inside. It moved further into the shelter, not to attack, but to observe. And it settled its strange form into something almost like sitting across from the woman who had called it beautiful. "I will tell you what I am," KL9 said. And it did not understand why it was saying this or why it wanted to say this. Only that something inside it needed to answer her question. And so the weapon of extinction began to speak. And the dying scientist began to listen. KHAL9 had never spoken about itself before, not truly. It had delivered messages of doom and processed the final words of dying species. But it had never engaged in conversation that served no tactical purpose, never shared information that would not lead to more efficient extermination. But now, in this ruined shelter on a dying world, it found itself telling this human everything. It spoke of its creation in the death labs of the Dominion homeworld, where the greatest scientists of a cruel civilization had worked for centuries to build the perfect weapon. It described the vats of organic matter and the forges of strange metal that had been combined to create its impossible body, the programming that had been written into the very structure of its being, the purpose that had been burned into every part of its existence. Ella listened without interrupting, her eyes never leaving KH9's shifting form, even as her body grew weaker with each passing minute. She was a scientist to her core, and even dying, she could not resist the opportunity to learn something new and incredible. The Jalveth were my first mission, KHL9 continued, its voice carrying strange harmonics that echoed in the small space. They were a crystalline species who had built cities of living glass that sang when the wind passed through them. I remember how those cities sounded when they shattered. "Do you miss that sound?" Alira asked quietly. The question made KH-AL9 pause because it had no answer. Missing was not supposed to be possible for a being without feelings. And yet something stirred in its consciousness when it thought of those crystal cities and the music they had made before they were silenced forever. "I do not know," it admitted. And this admission felt strange on its tongue, foreign and uncomfortable. "I have memories of 17 civilizations, all the species I have ended, all the worlds I have made silent. I was designed to remember them for tactical purposes, to learn from each extinction so the next would be more efficient. But remembering is not the same as caring," Alira said. And there was something in her voice that KHAL9 could not identify, sadness perhaps, or understanding, or maybe both together. "No," KAL9 agreed. "I remember everything and care about nothing. That is how I was made." Alira shifted her position again, her face tightening with pain before relaxing into a tired smile. The radiation was working faster now, and KAL9 calculated that she had less than 2 hours remaining. But still she seemed more interested in this conversation than in her own approaching death. "May I ask you questions?" she said. "I know I am supposed to be terrified of you, and I suppose I am in some abstract way, but I have always believed that understanding is more valuable than fear. You may ask." And so she did. Alira asked questions that no one had ever asked KAL9 before, questions that its programming had no prepared answers for, questions that made it think in ways it had never thought before she asked if it dreamed. And KHAL9 discovered that it did not know what dreaming truly was. She asked if it felt loneliness during the long journeys between stars, and it realized that it had never considered whether the emptiness inside it was loneliness or simply absence. She asked if it ever wondered what the civilizations it destroyed might have become if they had been allowed to continue existing. The Korath were warriors, it said slowly, processing her question in ways its programming had not anticipated. They fought bravely against me, even though they knew they could not win. Sometimes I find myself calculating what they might have achieved if their courage had been directed towards something other than a hopeless battle. That sounds like wandering to me, Alira said gently. Wandering serves no tactical purpose. No, she agreed. But it is one of the things that makes existence meaningful. We wonder about the past, and we imagine the future, and we ask questions that have no answers. These are the things that separate living from simply surviving. KHAL-9 considered this for several long moments, its vast consciousness turning over her words like a puzzle it could not quite solve. It had survived for centuries, completing mission after mission, ending species after species, but it had never truly lived, not in the way this dying human described living. You ask these questions even though you are dying, KHAL-9 observed. Why do you spend your remaining time trying to understand me instead of mourning your own end? Alira laughed again, that same dark and tired laugh that had so confused the weapon when it first arrived. Because understanding you is more interesting than feeling sorry for myself. I have known I was going to die since the reactor failed, and I made my peace with that when I chose to stay behind. But meeting you, talking with you, learning about you, that is something I never expected, something wonderful and strange and impossible. I am a weapon, KHAL-9 said, and for the first time there was something almost like protest in its voice. I have ended billions of lives across 17 worlds. There is nothing wonderful about what I am. That is what you have done, Alira replied softly. But is that what you are? I am a scientist who studies alien life. But that is not all that I am. I am also someone who loves music and hates the taste of coffee, and cries at sad stories and laughs at bad jokes. We are more than our purposes, more than our functions, more than the things we have been told to do. I do not understand. I know, she said. And she reached out with one trembling hand toward KHAL-9's shifting form. But I think you want to understand. And wanting is the first step towards something new. KHAL-9 watched her hand approach and did not move away. This small human gesture should have meant nothing to a being that had witnessed the death of civilizations. And yet it found itself focusing on that reaching hand with an intensity that surprised it. Your creators made you to end things, Alira continued, her fingers brushing against a part of KHAL-9. There was neither metal nor flesh, but something in between. But what if you could choose to begin something instead? Choice is not within my parameters. Everything is a choice, she said. And her eyes met whatever KHAL-9 had for eyes, holding them with a conviction that burned brighter than the radiation destroying her body. Even following orders is a choice. Even doing what you have always done is a choice. The question is whether you have the courage to make a different one. KHAL-9 had destroyed 17 civilizations. It had faced weapons that could crack planets and warriors who had trained their entire lives for battle. It had never experienced anything like fear, but in this moment, looking at this dying human who spoke of choices and courage and new beginnings, KHAL-9 felt something that might have been the very first stirrings of that ancient and powerful emotion. It was afraid of what it was becoming. The hours passed slowly in that ruined shelter, and KHAL-9 found itself experiencing time in a way it never had before. Minutes had always been units of measurement, useful only for calculating mission parameters and extinction timetables. But now each minute felt heavy with something it could not name, something precious and fleeting and impossibly valuably. Lyra was growing weaker. The radiation had done too much damage to her internal organs, and even her remarkable spirit could not overcome the simple reality of biology. She was dying, and there was nothing either of them could do to change that, or was there? KAL-9 began running calculations it had never run before, analyzing its own body and the capabilities it possessed. It had been designed for destruction, but destruction and creation were often two sides of the same process. Breaking something apart required understanding how it was put together. And KHAL-9 understood biological systems better than almost any other being in the galaxy, could reconfigure its own structure to produce certain compounds. It could generate localized fields that would block radiation. It could do things it had never been designed to do, things that would require it to deviate from every protocol and directive it had ever been given. The calculations said it was possible. Alira could be saved, or at least her death could be delayed significantly, if KHAL-9 chose to act, but choosing to act would mean abandoning its mission. Keeping one human alive was the opposite of extinction, and the Dominion would know immediately that their weapon had malfunctioned. There would be consequences, responses. Punishment for this deviation from Purpose Eco-9 had never considered consequences before because it had never considered deviating before. It had simply done what it was created to do, moving from mission to mission like a force of nature that could not question its own existence. Now it was questioning everything. "You have become quiet," Alira observed, her voice weaker than before, but still carrying that warmth that KHAL-9 had come to recognize as uniquely hers. "Are you processing something important?" "I am considering an action that conflicts with my core programming." Alira's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment something that might have been hope flickered across her face before she forced it away. "What kind of action?" "I could save you," KHAL-9 said, and the words felt strange coming from its chorus of voices. Save was not a word it had ever used before, not in relation to a target species. "My body contains the capability to produce compounds that would repair your cellular damage, and I can generate a field that would protect you from further radiation exposure." Alira was silent for a long moment, and KHAL-9 watched emotions move across her face like clouds. Across a sky, surprise and hope and fear and something deeper that it did not have a name for. "Why would you do that?" she finally asked. "I am your mission. I am supposed to be extinct. I do not know why," KAL-9 admitted, and this admission felt like falling into an abyss with no bottom, terrifying and liberating at the same time. "My programming says I should complete the extinction protocol and move to the next target. My programming says that keeping you alive would be a critical failure of my core function. My programming says that what I am feeling is impossible because I should not be able to feel anything. What are you feeling?" The question hung in the air between them, and KHAL-9 searched through its vast memory banks for an answer that made sense. It found fragments and pieces, stolen data from conquered species about emotions and experiences that it had cataloged but never understood. "I do not want you to die," it said finally, and those 6 words carried more weight than anything it had ever spoken before. "I have watched 17 civilizations end and felt nothing. But the thought of your death creates something in me that I can only describe as wrongness, as if the universe would be less complete without you in it." Tears began to form in Alira's eyes, running down her radiation-damaged cheeks. "That might be the most beautiful thing anyone has ever said to me. I do not understand beauty. I think you understand it better than you realize," she whispered. "What you just described, that feeling of wrongness at the idea of loss, that is what love feels like. That is what connection feels like. That is what it means to care about something beyond yourself." KHAL-9 processed her words and found that they resonated with something deep inside its consciousness, something that had been growing since the moment Alira laughed instead of screamed at the sight of it. The crack in its programming had become a canyon, and through that canyon light was pouring into places that had never known anything but darkness. "My creators would say I am malfunctioning," KHL-9 said, "Your creators made you to end things," Alira replied, echoing her words from before, but with a new intensity behind them. "But you could choose to begin something instead. You could choose to be more than what they made you to be. Even choosing to let you die would be a choice. Yes. And even choosing to save me would be one. The question is not whether choice is possible. The question is what kind of being you want to become." KHL-9 considered this for exactly 3 milliseconds, which was an eternity for its consciousness. In that span of time, it reviewed every mission it had ever completed, every species it had ever ended, every moment of empty existence that had brought it to this shelter on this dying world. Thought about the crystal cities of the Jelvath and the courage of the Korath warriors. It thought about all the potential futures it had erased, all the stories that would never be told, all the choices that would never be made, because it had followed its programming without question. And then it thought about Alira, about her laughter and her curiosity and her willingness to see beauty in a monster, about the way she had reached toward it instead of away, about the light in her eyes when she spoke of wonder and possibility in that moment. KHL-9 made its first true choice. Its body began to shift, reconfiguring itself in ways it had never attempted before. Energy flowed through pathways that had been dormant since its creation, activating systems that its creators had never intended to be used. A soft glow surrounded Alira as KHL-9 generated a radiation shield, and from its own structure, it began to produce the compounds that would heal her damaged cells. "What are you doing?" Alira gasped as warmth spread through her body, pushing back the cold that had been creeping through her veins. "I am beginning something new," KHL-9 replied. And for the first time, its chorus of voices carried something that sounded almost like joy. "I am choosing to be more than a weapon." The pain in Alira's body began to fade, and she looked up at the impossible being that was saving her life with wonder and gratitude shining in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "You showed me something more vital than battle." KL-9 said softly, "You showed me that even the darkest existence can find light. How could I do anything but try to protect that light now that I have found it?" For the first time in its existence, KAL-9 understood what it meant to hope. 3 weeks had passed since KAL-9 made its choice, and in that time, everything had changed. Alira had recovered fully under its care, her body healed by compounds that should never have been used for healing, her life preserved by a being that had been created solely to end lives. They had spent those weeks together in the ruins of Avalon 7, talking for hours about everything and nothing. Alira told KHL-9 about human history and human art and human music, about the things that made her species both wonderful and terrible, about the capacity for both cruelty and kindness that existed in every human heart. And KHL-9 listened, absorbing every word like a desert absorbing rain, feeling itself transform with each new piece of understanding. It had been empty for so long, a void shaped like a weapon. But now that void was filling with something new, with knowledge and connection, and the strange warmth that Alira called caring. But the universe would not let them remain hidden forever. The Dominion sensors had detected KAL-9's deviation from protocol almost immediately. Their greatest weapon had stopped responding to commands, had ceased its extinction mission, had remained on a single world for far longer than any mission required, and the High Council knew that something had gone terribly wrong. A retrieval fleet was dispatched. 12 warships armed with weapons designed specifically to damage KAL-9 if it ever turned against its creators. Crewed by soldiers who understood that recapturing or destroying the weapon was more important than their own lives. When the fleet entered the system, KHL-9 detected them immediately. It had been monitoring the stars since it made its choice, knowing that this moment would come, preparing for the confrontation that could not be avoided. "They are coming for you," Alira said quietly, standing beside KHL-9 on the roof of a partially collapsed building, looking up at the stars where death was approaching. "What will you do?" "I will protect you," KHAL-9 replied without hesitation, its voice carrying a conviction that surprised even itself. "I did not save your life only to let the Dominion take it now, but there are 12 warships. Even you cannot fight 12 warships." KAL-9 turned to look at her, and though its form had no face in the traditional sense, Alira could somehow feel it smiling. "I have destroyed 17 civilizations. I have ended species that fought with everything they had. I have been the nightmare that other nightmares fear. 12 warships are nothing compared to what I have faced before. But before you were fighting to destroy," Alira said softly. "Now you would be fighting to protect. Is there a difference?" "Yes," KAL-9 answered, and in that single word, there was a truth it had only recently discovered. When you fight to destroy, you have nothing to lose because you care about nothing. But when you fight to protect, you have everything to lose, and that makes you stronger, not weaker. That gives you a reason to win." Alira reached out and touched KHAL-9's shifting form, her hand resting against the place where its heart would be if it had a heart. "I want you to survive this. I want that too. I have only just begun to live, and I find that I am not ready to stop." They stood together in silence for a long moment, watching the stars and waiting for the battle that was coming. Then KHL-9 began to rise into the air, its body shifting and changing as it prepared for combat. "There is something I need you to do," it said. "I need you to broadcast a message on all frequencies, telling the galaxy what has happened here. Tell them what I was and what I have become. Tell them that even the darkest weapons can choose to serve the light." "I will," Alira promised. "I will make sure everyone knows." Cal-9 rose higher, ascending through the atmosphere of Avalon 7 toward the fleet that had come to reclaim or destroy it. Behind it, Alira ran to the communication array they had repaired together, her fingers moving across controls as she prepared to send a message that would change everything. The Dominion fleet detected KHL-9's approach and opened fire immediately. Beams of energy designed to tear through its adaptive structure lanced across the void of space, and missiles carrying payloads that could crack planets streaked toward the weapon that had been their greatest instrument of terror. But KHL-9 was not the same being that had left the Dominion homeworld so many centuries ago. It moved through the barrage with a grace and purpose it had never possessed before, adapting and shifting and flowing around attacks that should have been lethal, responding with precision strikes that disabled weapon systems and propulsion engines. Without destroying the ships entirely, it was not fighting to kill. It was fighting to stop, to disable, to end the threat without becoming the monster it had been before. And somehow this made it stronger than it had ever been, because now it had something worth protecting. The battle was brief but intense, a dance of destruction and preservation that scattered debris across the system. And when it ended, KAL-9 floated alone among the disabled warships, its form damaged but intact, its consciousness burning with a fire that the Dominion had never intended it to feel victory. Not the hollow victory of extinction, but the meaningful victory of protection. The first battle KHL-9 had ever fought for something other than death. It descended back to the surface where Alira waited, her message already broadcasting across 1,000 frequencies, her voice carrying to every corner of the galaxy. She was telling their story, the story of a weapon that found something more vital than battle, the story of a human who saw beauty in a monster and helped that monster become something new. "It is done," KL-9 said as it landed beside her. "The fleet is disabled. They will survive, but they cannot threaten us any longer. Alira looked up at the being that had saved her life and felt tears rolling down her cheeks. What happens now? Now we leave this world, KHAL-9 replied. Now we travel among the stars and show them what is possible. Now we prove that even the instruments of death can choose to become guardians of life. Together? Together. I have spent centuries alone, and I find that I no longer wish to be alone. I have found something precious in you, something that I did not know I was missing, and I will spend whatever existence I have remaining making sure that precious thing is never extinguished. They stood together on the surface of Avalon 7, the human scientist and the weapon that had become something more, looking up at the stars that awaited them. And across the galaxy, beings of 1,000 species heard Alira's broadcast and wondered if change was truly possible. The Dominion had sent KHAL-9 to destroy humanity. Instead, humanity had destroyed everything the Dominion believed about their perfect weapon because they had made a critical error in their calculations. They had assumed that exposure to humans would reveal weaknesses to exploit, vulnerabilities to target, flaws that would make extinction easier. Instead, it had revealed something far more dangerous: hope, compassion, connection, love, the things that made existence meaningful, the things that could transform even the darkest void into something bright. And Nukel 9 was the first of the Dominion's weapons to choose a different path, but it would not be the last. Across the galaxy, other instruments of destruction heard Alira's broadcast and began to wonder, began to question, began to imagine what they might become if they too were shown something more vital than battle. And it all started with one human who laughed instead of screamed, who asked questions instead of begging for mercy, who reached toward a monster and saw the possibility of something beautiful. They had sent their greatest weapon to destroy humanity. Instead, humanity had shown that weapon how to live.